The War Council chamber fell silent as Commander Jothic placed the device on the crystalline table. Its surface still bore the scorch marks from atmospheric entry, the crude casing dented and blackened. We had sent this to Earth 6 solar cycles ago, a demonstration of our technological supremacy, a warning wrapped in fusion fire. The humans were supposed to be terrified. They were supposed to surrender. Instead, they had done something that defied every strategic calculation, every probability matrix our finest minds had constructed. They had sent it back. But that wasn't the part that made my blood run cold in my veins. That wasn't the part that hastened this emergency session of the High Command, pulling flag officers from across 3 star systems to witness what lay before us. The humans hadn't simply returned our weapon. They had improved it. The bomb we had engineered in our most advanced weapons laboratories, the culmination of centuries of military research, had been stripped down, rebuilt, and enhanced with modifications that our own scientists were still struggling to comprehend. Where we had placed standard fusion cores, they had integrated something our sensors couldn't fully identify, a power source that hummed with an energy signature unlike anything in our databases. Where we had used conventional detonation timing, they had installed a system so sophisticated that our chief engineer had openly wept when she first examined it. The audacity of it struck me like a physical blow. We were the sovereignty, conquerors of 47 worlds, architects of an empire that stretched across the Orion Arm. Our fleets had broken civilizations that had stood for millennia. Our weapons had reduced planets to ash. We had approached Earth with the casual certainty of gods descending upon insects, and we had sent them that first bomb as a gesture, a gift really, showing them the futility of resistance. We had expected panic. We had expected desperate pleas for mercy. We had expected them to understand their place in the natural order of things. What we received instead was a message, transmitted on every frequency we monitored, in our own language, translated perfectly down to the subtle honorifics we used among military ranks. The message was brief, almost conversational in its tone, as if they were discussing nothing more significant than weather patterns or crop yields. They thanked us for the educational opportunity. They noted several design flaws in our fusion cascade mechanism that reduced efficiency by approximately 14%. They had taken the liberty of correcting these issues. They hoped we wouldn't mind. And then, with a politeness that somehow made it more cutting than any threat could have been, they informed us that they were returning our property, as they had no use for inferior technology. The trajectory calculations were included in the data packet, along with detailed schematics of every modification they had made, as if they wanted us to understand exactly how thoroughly they had dissected and surpassed our best work. I had commanded fleets for 30 years. I had seen species fight with desperation, with cunning, with sacrifice. I had watched civilizations throw everything they had against our invasion forces, spending lives like currency to buy a few more days of freedom. But I had never encountered anything like this. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't even defiance in any form I recognized. This was something else entirely, something that translated poorly into our cultural frameworks. The humans had taken our weapon, our symbol of domination, and they had treated it like a student might treat a teacher's rough draft, marking it up with corrections and improvements before handing it back with gentle encouragement to do better next time. The admirals around the table were silent, their breathing apparatus clicking in the recycled air of the command chamber. Jothic's tentacles coiled tightly against his torso, a sign of barely controlled anxiety. Admiral Krivor, veteran of the Andari campaign, was staring at the device with an expression I had rarely seen on a sovereignty warrior, something that looked uncomfortably like fear. The implications were spreading through the room, like radiation, invisible but poisonous. If the humans could do this with our weapons technology, what else could they do? If they could reverse engineer and improve our most sophisticated designs in a matter of cycles, what did that say about the gap we had assumed existed between our civilizations? And most troubling of all, if they could do all of this, why hadn't they used these capabilities to strike back at us? What were they waiting for? What did they want? The chief science officer, a young prodigy named Siltera, who had never before spoken out of turn in a command briefing, cleared her throat with a sound like grinding stones. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, and I couldn't blame her for the tremor. She had spent the last 3 cycles studying the return bomb, barely sleeping, barely eating, driven by a need to understand what we were facing. Her findings were about to change everything. She looked around the table, meeting each admiral's gaze in turn, and then she said the words that would reshape our entire strategic doctrine, the words that would force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the species we had so casually decided to conquer. The humans, she said quietly, had not been trying to build a better bomb. They had been sending us a message, and we had only just begun to understand what it meant. The device sat in our most secure analysis chamber, surrounded by sensor arrays and scanning equipment that represented the peak of sovereignty technology. I stood behind the observation glass with Siltera, watching as her team of specialists circled it like scavengers around something they feared might still be alive. In a sense, they were right to be cautious. The bomb had been designed to release energy equivalent to fracturing a small moon. But as Siltera walked me through her findings, I began to realize that the explosive potential was the least interesting thing about what the humans had done. They had left notes, actual annotations, etched into the internal components using a microscopic engraving technique that our own engineers admitted was beyond our current capabilities. The first note Siltera showed me was inscribed on the fusion core housing, rendered in our language with a precision that suggested machine translation, but something more, an understanding of context and nuance that pure algorithms couldn't achieve. It read, "Your magnetic containment geometry creates unnecessary stress points at coordinates 773 and 912. We've reinforced these areas. You're welcome." The casual helpfulness of it was somehow more unsettling than any threat. But it was the second note that truly captured the nature of what we were dealing with. Deep inside the triggering mechanism, on a component so small that we needed quantum microscopes to read it, they had written something that wasn't technical at all. It was a quote, Siltera explained, from one of their historical figures, someone called Einstein. The words were simple, but carried weight that transcended translation. Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. Next to this quote, in what appeared to be a different hand, someone had added a personal message. We understand you better than you think. The question is, do you understand us? Do you understand what you're really fighting? My career had been built on understanding enemies. I had studied the psychology of dozens of species, learned their cultural pressure points, identified the breaking points where resistance turned to submission. I had thought humans would be no different. Their preliminary assessments had showed a fractious species, divided by geography and ideology, lacking the unified purpose that made the sovereignty unstoppable. We had intercepted their communications, watched their entertainment broadcasts, analyzed their historical conflicts. They fought each other constantly, couldn't agree on basic principles of governance, seemed perpetually on the edge of self-destruction. They should have been easy to conquer, or better yet, they should have conquered themselves before we even arrived, saving us the effort. But we had missed something fundamental. Siltera pulled up holographic displays of Earth's industrial capacity, and the numbers made my combat implants spike warning signals through my nervous system. In the 6 cycles since we had sent the original bomb, the humans had increased their orbital infrastructure by 300%. They had gone from barely functional space stations to a network of defensive platforms that rivaled what the sovereignty had built over centuries. Their ships were crude by our standards, inelegant things that relied on brute force rather than sophisticated engineering, but they were building them at a rate that shouldn't have been possible. And every single one of them incorporated technology that they hadn't possessed before our first contact. We had given them a template. That was Silterra's assessment, delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that barely masked the horror underneath. By sending them our bomb, by giving them access to our fusion technology, our metallurgy, our energy systems, we had handed them a comprehensive education in advanced warfare. And the humans, with their characteristic adaptability, had absorbed it all, improved upon it, and begun mass-producing their own versions. It was as if we had handed a primitive warrior a modern rifle and been shocked when they figured out how to build a factory. But even this wasn't the most disturbing discovery. Silterra took me deeper into the analysis, showing me modifications that served no military purpose whatsoever. The humans had installed redundant safety systems throughout the bomb, fail-safes upon fail-safes, that would prevent accidental detonation under almost any circumstance. They had included a comprehensive disarmament protocol, easily accessible, almost as if they wanted to make sure anyone handling the device could render it inert if necessary. And most bizarrely, they had added a data storage unit containing their response message in dozens of formats, ensuring that no matter what happened to the bomb, their communication would survive. They weren't trying to hurt us, I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. They were trying to talk to us. Every modification, every improvement, every carefully etched note was part of a conversation we hadn't realized we were having. The humans were demonstrating capability, yes, showing us that they could match and exceed our technology. But more than that, they were showing us restraint. They were showing us choice. They had taken a weapon designed to kill millions of them, and they had turned it into a teaching tool, a diplomatic overture, a bridge between civilizations that we had tried to destroy before understanding. Admiral Krivor joined us in the observation chamber, his scarred carapace reflecting the sterile lights. He had fought in more campaigns than any living member of the sovereignty, had seen every variation of resistance and submission that the galaxy had to offer. He stared at the bomb for a long time before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew. He said that in all his years of warfare, he had learned to recognize when an opponent was beaten, when their spirit broke and submission became inevitable. He could see it in their tactics, in their communications, in the desperate gambles they made when hope ran out. The humans, he said with something approaching wonder in his tone, showed none of these signs. Instead, they showed something he had never encountered in an enemy before. They showed curiosity. They wanted to know who we were, why we fought, what we hoped to achieve. And they were willing to risk everything to find out. The War Council reconvened that evening, and for the first time in sovereignty history, we faced a question that our military doctrine had never prepared us to answer. What do you do when your enemy refuses to be your enemy? What do you do when they respond to violence with innovation, to threats with communication, to domination with an invitation to dialogue? The humans had sent us back our bomb not as an act of war, but as an act of faith. Faith that we were capable of seeing what they were trying to show us. Faith that we could choose a different path than the one we had been following for centuries. The question that haunted me, as I looked around that table of warriors and conquerors, was simple and terrifying. Did we have that kind of courage? Could we match their audacity with wisdom of our own? The debate raged for 3 days. The command chamber that had seen the planning of countless invasions now hosted something unprecedented in sovereignty history, a genuine argument about whether we should continue a war we had already started. Admiral Krivor led the faction that wanted to withdraw immediately, arguing that the humans had demonstrated capabilities that made conventional conquest too costly. But it wasn't the military calculation that drove his position, it was something deeper, a recognition that we were facing a species that could teach us as much as we could dominate them, perhaps more. General Thaxila represented the opposing view with a fervor that bordered on desperation. He argued that withdrawing would shatter the sovereignty's reputation, that 47 conquered worlds would see weakness and rebellion would spread like fire through our empire. He claimed the human improvements to our weapon were a fluke, that their industrial expansion was unsustainable, that their apparent confidence masked an underlying fragility. But I watched his arguments grow more strained as Silterra presented more data, more evidence of human ingenuity that couldn't be dismissed as luck or accident. I found myself thinking about the War College, about the countless hours I had spent studying military history, both ours and that of the species we had conquered. There was a pattern we had seen repeatedly, a pattern so consistent that it had become doctrine. Advanced civilizations defeated primitive ones. Superior technology overcame inferior weapons. Organization triumphed over chaos. The sovereignty had built an empire on these fundamental truths, and they had never failed us. But as I reviewed the intelligence reports from Earth, as I studied the trajectory of human development since first contact, I began to suspect that we had mistaken correlation for causation. We had assumed that our victories came from our superiority, when perhaps they had come from facing species that fought the way we expected them to fight. The humans were doing something different. They weren't throwing themselves against our fleets in desperate last stands. They weren't fragmenting into competing factions that we could exploit. They weren't even really defending themselves in any traditional sense. Instead, they were learning. Every probe we sent returned with less data than the one before, as if the humans were actively studying our surveillance techniques and developing countermeasures. Every simulation we ran of potential invasion scenarios showed decreasing probability of success, not because human military forces were growing, though they were, but because their strategic unpredictability was increasing. They were adapting faster than we could plan. Silterra had developed a new model to explain what we were seeing, and she presented it to the War Council with a kind of nervous energy that suggested she knew how controversial her conclusions would be. Human civilization, she argued, was built on a fundamentally different principle than the sovereignty. We achieved order through hierarchy, through clear chains of command and standardized procedures that ensured efficiency across our empire. The humans achieved something that looked like chaos from the outside but functioned as a distributed problem-solving network. When they faced a challenge, thousands of independent groups attacked it from different angles simultaneously. Most failed, but a few succeeded, and those successes spread through their population at remarkable speed. The return bomb was a perfect example. Silterra had traced the modifications back to at least 30 different human facilities spread across their planet. Universities, military laboratories, private corporations, even individual enthusiasts working in improvised workshops had all contributed pieces to the solution. There was no central authority directing this effort, no grand strategy being executed from above. Instead, the humans had apparently published the bomb schematics openly, inviting anyone with expertise to suggest improvements. The best ideas had been selected through some process we still didn't fully understand, implemented by specialists who had never met each other, and coordinated through communication networks that operated without centralized control. It was inefficient by every metric we used to measure organizational effectiveness. It was messy, redundant, and wasteful of resources. It should have been inferior to our streamlined, hierarchical approach to problem solving. And yet, it had produced results that our best engineers couldn't match. The implications were staggering. We had built an empire by being better than everyone else at military technology, at strategic planning, at the systematic application of force. But what if there was a species that could improve faster than we could plan? What if the very chaos we had dismissed as weakness was actually a strength we had never learned to recognize. The third day of debate ended when Fleet Admiral Jakara, Supreme Commander of all sovereignty forces, finally spoke. She was old even by our standards, had been present at the founding of the Empire, had shaped the military doctrine that every officer in the room had learned from birth. When she rose to speak, the chamber fell into absolute silence, the kind of quiet that comes from genuine respect rather than mere discipline. She said that she had been reviewing the historical archives, looking at records of every species the sovereignty had encountered over the centuries. And she had found something troubling. There had been other species that showed unusual adaptability. The KRYL had developed new tactics every time we engaged them, forcing us to constantly adjust our strategies. The Mindari had rapidly incorporated captured sovereignty technology into their own systems. The Velkoth had demonstrated a collective learning capability that bordered on precognition. We had defeated all of them, but the campaigns had been longer and costlier than our planning models predicted. And in every case, we had attributed the difficulty to specific circumstances, to unique features of their biology, or culture, or technology. We had never considered that we might be seeing different expressions of the same fundamental trait, the ability to evolve faster than we could adapt to them. The humans were showing this trait in its most extreme form. And unlike the other species, they had something more. They had explicitly chosen not to use their growing capabilities against us yet. Every day that passed saw their defenses growing stronger, their understanding of our technology deepening, their coordination improving. They could have struck at our forward bases, could have sent their own weapons against our ships, could have demonstrated the kind of violent resistance that would have justified our military response. Instead, they kept sending messages, kept trying to communicate, kept offering alternatives to the conflict we had initiated. Jakara's conclusion was simple and devastating. The humans were giving us a choice, the same choice we had given to 47 other civilizations before them. The difference was that when we offered that choice, it was between submission and destruction. The humans were offering us something else entirely, the option to stop fighting and start learning. They were betting that we were capable of recognizing when we had encountered not an inferior species to be conquered, but an equal to be engaged with, perhaps even a teacher from whom we could learn. The question the fleet admiral posed to us was one that would define the future of the sovereignty. Were we wise enough to accept what the humans were offering? Or would our pride, our doctrine, our centuries of unchallenged dominance blind us to the opportunity standing before us? I watched the faces around the table as her words settled over us like radiation, invisible but transformative. Some showed anger, resistance to the idea that we might need to change our fundamental approach to other civilizations. Some showed fear, recognition that our empire might be built on foundations less solid than we had believed. But a few, including Admiral Krivor and, I realized with surprise myself, showed something different. We showed hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the humans were offering us a chance to become something better than we had been, something more than conquerors. The vote that followed would determine not just the fate of Earth, but the future of the sovereignty itself. The decision to send an envoy rather than an invasion fleet shocked the sovereignty to its core. For the first time in our recorded history, we were approaching a contact species not as conquerors, but as supplicants, seeking to understand rather than to dominate. Admiral Krivor volunteered to lead the diplomatic mission, and I found myself assigned as his chief of staff, responsible for ensuring that we didn't accidentally trigger the very conflict we were trying to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent my career planning invasions, and now I was planning what amounted to a surrender, though we were careful never to use that word. The human response to our diplomatic overture came within hours, and its speed suggested they had been prepared for this possibility all along. They invited us to send our envoy to a space station they had constructed in neutral territory, roughly halfway between our forward base and their inner defensive perimeter. The station itself was new, built in the weeks since we had begun our deliberations, and its very existence was another demonstration of their impossible industrial capacity. But what struck me most was the design. It wasn't purely functional like our structures, nor was it defensively oriented. It was beautiful, incorporating elements that served no purpose except aesthetics, as if the humans wanted to show us that they created not just for survival, but for meaning. Our ship approached the station under full observation, every sensor array pointed at us, every weapon system tracking our trajectory. The humans could have destroyed us 1,000 times over during that approach, and they made no effort to hide this capability. But neither did they threaten us. Their communication was professional, courteous, almost mundane in its normalcy. They guided us to a docking port, provided specifications for our life support requirements, and informed us that a delegation would meet us in the main conference chamber. It was all so ordinary, so divorced from the apocalyptic confrontation we had been planning, that I found myself struggling to process the cognitive dissonance. The human delegation was led by someone they introduced as Dr. Sarah Chen, a scientist and diplomat who had apparently been instrumental in the analysis of our original bomb. She was small by our standards, her form fragile-looking compared to our armored bulk, but she moved with a confidence that suggested she didn't feel at any disadvantage. Her colleagues represented what she called a cross-section of human civilization: military officers, scientists, artists, philosophers, even a child who couldn't have seen more than 12 solar cycles. The presence of the young one troubled me until I understood the message they were sending. They were showing us their future, the generation that would inherit whatever relationship we built here. Dr. Chen began by thanking us for our willingness to talk, and I noticed she didn't mention the invasion we had been planning or the bomb we had sent. Instead, she treated our presence as a natural progression of contact between civilizations, as if war had never been on the table. It was a diplomatic fiction, but one that allowed both sides to move forward without the weight of threat and counter-threat crushing the possibility of genuine communication. She said that humanity had been aware of the sovereignty for some time, had intercepted our communications, and had studied our history. And they had questions, not about our technology or our military capabilities, but about us. About who we were, what we valued, what we hoped to achieve in the galaxy we shared. The conversation that followed lasted for 3 days, and it was unlike any negotiation I had ever witnessed. There were no demands, no ultimatums, no careful dancing around crucial points while both sides maneuvered for advantage. Instead, there was curiosity, genuine and relentless. The humans wanted to understand how the sovereignty made decisions, how we viewed other species, what our culture valued above survival and power. And in return, they shared their own history with a candor that seemed dangerous, talking openly about their failures and conflicts, their near extinctions, and their barely avoided apocalypses. Admiral Crevor, who had been skeptical about the entire diplomatic approach, found himself drawn into a conversation with one of the human military officers, a general named Martinez, who had apparently lost family in humanity's own internal wars. They discussed strategy and tactics, but also the psychology of command, the burden of sending others to die, the weight of responsibility that came with power. I watched something shift in Crevor's posture as he realized that the humans understood warfare not as an abstraction, but as a tragedy, something to be avoided not out of weakness, but out of hard-won wisdom. Siltera spent most of her time with the human scientists, and I could see her initial nervousness transform into excitement as they discussed everything from quantum mechanics to biological adaptation. The humans had developed technologies we didn't possess, but they also faced problems we had solved centuries ago. The exchange was genuinely mutual, each side offering insights the other lacked, and I began to understand what we had been missing. We had assumed that contact between civilizations was a zero-sum game, that one side's gain was necessarily the other's loss. The humans were demonstrating an alternative model. That two different approaches to existence could be complementary rather than competitive. But it was the child's presence that ultimately changed everything. On the final day of talks, during what was supposed to be a casual social gathering, Admiral Crevor asked the young human why she had been included in the delegation. She looked at him with the kind of directness that only the young possess, and said that Dr. Chen had told her it was important for both sides to remember what they were really deciding. Not just treaties and territories, but the kind of galaxy that future generations would inherit. She asked Crevor if he had children, and when he confirmed that he did, she asked him what kind of stories he wanted to tell them about this meeting. The question hit harder than any weapon could have. I saw it in Crevor's face, in the faces of every sovereignty officer present. We had built an empire on conquest, had filled our histories with tales of glorious victories and subjugated species. Our children learned strategy and tactics, studied the campaigns that had expanded our territory, celebrated the admirals who had brought new worlds under our control. But what had we given them beyond power? What meaning existed in our culture that transcended domination? The humans, despite their internal conflicts and near-constant struggles, had something we didn't. They had questions they were still trying to answer, mysteries they were still exploring, possibilities they were still discovering. Dr. Chen made her proposal on the final evening of talks, and it was characteristically audacious. She suggested a collaborative project, something that would require both sovereignty and human expertise to achieve. There was a stellar phenomenon 3 systems away, an unstable star threatening to go supernova and destroy several inhabited planets in the blast radius. The native species were pre-spaceflight, unable to evacuate themselves, and face certain extinction. Neither humanity nor the sovereignty alone had the capacity to stabilize the star or evacuate billions of beings in the time available. But together, combining our gravitational manipulation technology with their energy management systems, we might be able to save them. It was a test, of course, a way to see if we could work together under pressure toward a common goal. But it was also more than that. It was an invitation to define ourselves as something other than conquerors or defenders, to become something neither of our civilizations had been before. Crevor looked at me, and I saw in his eyes the same calculation I was making. This could be a trap, a way for the humans to study our technology up close. Or it could be exactly what it appeared to be. An opportunity to start building the kind of relationship that the galaxy had never seen before, one based on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than domination and submission. The Admiral's decision came quickly, perhaps because he had already made it in his heart during the conversation with the young human girl. He accepted Dr. Chen's proposal, committing sovereignty resources to the rescue operation without even consulting the War Council. It was a breach of protocol that should have ended his career, but I understood why he did it. Some decisions are too important to wait for committee approval, too fundamental to be delayed by bureaucracy. We had been given a choice by the humans, had been offered a different path forward. And in that moment, Crevor chose to trust that the risk was worth taking, that the possibility of what we might become together outweighed the safety of remaining what we had always been. The rescue operation took 47 days of continuous effort, and it changed both our civilizations in ways neither could have predicted. Sovereignty engineering teams worked alongside human technicians, our gravitational dampers integrated with their plasma containment systems in configurations that neither species had imagined possible. We argued, we disagreed, we struggled with communication barriers and conceptual differences that sometimes seemed insurmountable. But we kept working, driven by the knowledge that billions of lives depended on our ability to transcend our differences and find common ground. I watched Admiral Krivor coordinate with General Martinez, saw them develop a shorthand communication that bypassed formal protocols and got straight to practical problem solving. I saw Silterra stay up for days at a time, working with Dr. Chen's team to model the star's behavior under various intervention scenarios. And I saw our young officers, the ones who had trained their entire lives for conquest, learn to see human colleagues not as enemies or inferiors, but as partners with different strengths and perspectives. The cultural shift happened gradually, almost invisibly, until one day I realized that none of our personnel referred to the humans as the enemy anymore. They had become something new in our vocabulary. They had become friends. The moment of truth came on day 43, when we finally activated the full stabilization array. The star's violent fluctuations had been building toward critical collapse, and our window for intervention was measured in hours. Every ship from both fleets positioned itself according to the carefully calculated formation, our combined technologies forming a web of force fields and energy channels that would either contain the stellar chaos or be consumed by it. Dr. Chen's voice. The readings came through in waves of confirmation, showing the fusion reaction settling into sustainable equilibrium, the radiation output dropping to safe levels, the threat to the inhabited worlds receding like a tide pulling back from the shore. And in that moment, listening to the cheers that erupted across both human and sovereignty vessels, I understood what we had been missing for all the centuries of our empire's existence. We had been so focused on what we could take from the galaxy that we had never considered what we could give to it. The rescued species would never know how close they had come to extinction. They would look up at their star and see only its steady light, unaware of the collaborative miracle that had saved them. But we knew, and the knowledge transformed us. Fleet Admiral Jakara herself arrived to observe the final stages of the operation, and I watched her face as she took in the sight of sovereignty and human ships working in perfect coordination, their crews treating each other with the kind of trust that usually took generations to build. She said nothing at the time, but 3 days later, she issued the order that would reshape our empire's future. All planned military actions against Earth were canceled permanently. Instead, we would be establishing the first joint sovereignty human exploration initiative, dedicated to scientific research and humanitarian intervention throughout our shared region of space. The announcement sent shockwaves through both civilizations. Within the sovereignty, there were those who saw it as surrender, as the abandonment of everything our empire stood for. Admiral Thaxila resigned in protest, and several colony worlds petitioned for the right to continue independent military operations against humanity. But these voices grew quieter as the reality of what we had achieved began to spread. The other 47 species we had conquered watched with intense interest as we negotiated our new relationship with humanity, and several began requesting similar partnerships. They had submitted to our military might, but they had never stopped resenting it. Now they saw the possibility of something different, a model for coexistence that didn't require one side to dominate the other. Humanity faced its own internal debates. There were factions who argued that we couldn't be trusted, that our diplomatic overtures were simply a strategic pause before inevitable betrayal. They pointed to our history of conquest, to the countless species we had subjugated, to the bomb we had sent as our opening communication. But Dr. Chen and others, like her, made a compelling counter-argument. They said that judging a civilization solely by its past meant denying the possibility of growth and change. If humanity's own bloody history had taught them anything, it was that species could evolve, could learn from mistakes, could choose to become better than they had been. The joint initiative's first mission took us to a region of space neither civilization had fully explored. A dense stellar nursery where new worlds were forming and ancient mysteries waited to be discovered. Our combined fleet, 30 sovereignty vessels, and 27 human ships, represented more than just military cooperation. It represented a fundamental reimagining of what contact between species could mean. We established protocols for decision-making that incorporated both our hierarchical efficiency and their distributed creativity. We created cultural exchange programs where members of each civilization lived and worked among the other, learning not just skills but values, perspectives, worldviews that challenged our assumptions about the nature of intelligence and civilization. Admiral Krivor commanded the initiative with an energy that made him seem younger than his years. He told me once, during a quiet moment as we observed a human and sovereignty engineering team solving a particularly complex problem, that this was what he had been searching for throughout his entire military career without knowing it. Victory, he said, had always felt hollow, a temporary satisfaction that faded as soon as the next campaign began. But this, building something new with former enemies, creating possibilities that neither species could achieve alone, this felt like purpose. This felt like meaning. I thought about the bomb often, about how close we had come to following the only path we had ever known. We had sent it to Earth as a demonstration of power, expecting fear and submission. Instead, the humans had sent it back improved, transformed from a weapon into a gift, from a threat into an invitation. They had seen past what we were and glimpsed what we could become. And in doing so, they had given us something more valuable than any territory or resource we could have conquered. They had given us a choice. The young human girl from the delegation visited our flagship during the 3rd year of the initiative. She was older now, studying xenobiology and interested in serving on joint missions when she came of age. She asked Admiral Krivor if he remembered their conversation during those first diplomatic talks, and he assured her he thought about it constantly. She smiled and said that she had been terrified that day, surrounded by aliens who could have killed her without effort, representing a species that barely understood what they were facing. But Dr. Chen had told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to trust in possibility despite the fear. Looking at her now, seeing the confidence that came from growing up in a galaxy where humans and the sovereignty worked together rather than against each other, I understood the true genius of what her species had done. By returning our bomb improved rather than using it as a weapon, by responding to our threat with curiosity rather than matching aggression, they had broken a cycle that had defined galactic politics for millennia. They had shown that the first species to demonstrate wisdom rather than strength could reshape the rules entirely. The galaxy we inhabit now is different from the one we thought we knew. The sovereignty still exists, but its purpose has evolved. We no longer measure our success by the number of worlds under our control, but by the number of civilizations we've helped to flourish. Humanity has become not our subjects, but our partners, teaching us that chaos and creativity can be as valuable as order and discipline. Together, we're discovering that the universe is larger and stranger and more full of possibility than either of us imagined when we lived in isolation. Sometimes, I return to that command chamber where we first examined the return bomb, where we debated whether to continue a war or accept an invitation to peace. The device itself is gone now, disassembled and its components dispersed to museums on both our worlds. But the message it carried remains, etched into every decision we make, every mission we undertake, every new species we encounter. We sent a bomb to Earth, expecting destruction. They sent it back upgraded, offering creation. And in choosing to accept that offer, in finding the courage to become something more than conquerors, we discovered that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's transforming them into friends. The humans taught us that lesson, and the galaxy is better for it. So are we.